Some say it must be a fictitious we. And the reason is because they think that Luke's depiction of Paul's thinking differs from the depiction of Paul's thinking in Paul's letters. Well, there's some truth in that. Nobody says that Paul wrote the book of Acts. Obviously, Luke is a different person. But he's not so much of a different person that we must assume that he couldn't have known him or couldn't have traveled with him. After all, if one of my students were to write a biography of my life, and you'd see what they'd choose to emphasize, what they would choose to emphasize about me would be different from probably what I would choose to emphasize about me. In fact, the leading difference that scholars have often seen between Luke's depiction of Paul's theology and Paul's own depiction of Paul's theology is that they say that, well, in Acts, Paul is favorable towards the law, whereas in Paul's letters, Paul is against the law. Well, that's a very tendentious reading of Paul. I won't say historically where it came from, but I will say that in the past few decades, the majority of Pauline scholars have repudiated that view. They no longer say that Paul was against the law. And therefore, scholars of Acts who are using that contrast to try to distinguish Luke's Paul from Paul's Paul need to catch up on their Pauline scholarship. But in any case, why do they assume it's a fictitious we? We have fictitious we's or fictitious I's in fictitious documents, such as novels. We do not have fictitious we's or fictitious I's normally in historical works, which the majority of scholars agree that the book of Acts is. Not all agree on how historical it is, but the majority agree that Acts is a historical monograph, and it's a work of ancient historiography. The famous early 20th century Harvard classicist, Sir Arthur Darby Knock, said that at most he could think of one example in historical literature, in non-fictitious literature, where first person plural or first person period was used fictitiously. In almost all cases in historical works, a first person meant that the author was claiming to be there, or the author was claiming to be writing, or something like that. Moreover, if it were fictitious, why would it be fictitious only at these places, so that it leaves off in Philippi and picks up in Philippi? And it's such obscure places. I mean, you would think that the we would have carried through the entire narrative. The we could have been a disciple of Jesus. The we could have been present at the empty tomb. The we could have been present at Pentecost. But the author can't say that because apparently the audience knows who the author is, and they know when the author was with Paul and when the author wasn't with Paul. The we appears in a very obscure way. The author is not trying to make a big deal about being present. The author is simply including himself at points where the author was present. Some say it's not fictitious, although some have said, well, you have this fictitious presence of a we in sea voyages. That has been very strongly answered by scholars who've shown that most we voyages don't have a we in them. When the we is there, normally it's because the author was claiming to be there. And outside of sea voyages, it's the same as inside of sea voyages. So the majority of scholars have rejected that approach. But some scholars have said, okay, it's not fictitious. It belongs to a travel journal. And that's entirely possible. It's possible that it belongs to a travel journal. But keep in mind, Luke, at the beginning of his first volume, mentions many possible sources. He mentions getting material that goes back to eyewitnesses. Presumably, a lot of the material that came to him could have come in first-person form. And yet, nowhere else does he preserve a first-person form. Why would Luke become an inept editor of his material at this point, and at this point only? Doesn't it seem more likely that if there was a travel journal that was in use, it was Luke's own travel journal. So if it was a travel journal including we, it would have been Luke's travel journal. In other ancient literature, we normally means we, just like it does today. So instead of complicating what's simple, we'll just leave it simple. Usually I can say I'm in a strong consensus of scholarship. On this point, there is debate, but personally I think that the case is strong enough that I'm willing to say I think this is a really strong case. But